Welcome to Releasing Trauma, a Survivor's Podcast. I am your host, Tracy Osborne. I am a survivor of emotional bullying, rape, sexual assault, domestic abuse, and grief. After losing my husband in 2019, I set off on a new adventure to help other women release their trauma and create a life they can cherish. Each week, I will feature a guest expert or survivor to share their stories, tips, wisdom, and more. The goal is so that you can take away even just the smallest nugget of information you can use in your life right now to make a change, and to remind you that you're not alone. There is life after trauma, and you can move from victim to thriver and create a life you can cherish. Hi, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of Releasing Trauma. I am your host, Tracy Osborne. With me today is Melissa Ming Foynes, and we are going to be talking about navigating pregnancy and birth as a sexual assault survivor. Not something that we've really talked about on the show, so I'm really excited to get into this topic. Melissa, thank you so much for coming on the show. I really am excited to talk to you today.
Oh, you're so welcome. It really is a true honor to be here. And this is a topic that I am really passionate about and frankly don't think we talk enough about. So I am happy to contribute in whatever way that I can to this conversation.
Well, before we get into the topic, I always like to have our speakers tell us a little bit about them. So why don't you give us a little bit about your story?
Sure. So, like many of the people listening, I occupy many different roles in my life. Personally, I am a mom, I have a partner, I have many loved ones that I support. I'm a lover of nature and animals and the planet. And professionally, I also have a number of different roles as well. I'm a clinical psychologist by training with a specialty in trauma, grief, and loss, and trauma being pretty broadly defined, different types of trauma that we can experience, including trauma related to birth experience and loss of children, as well as working with people who have a trauma history and are becoming parents. And I also am a holistic integrative wellness coach. I am an Ayurvedic doula, and I am a trauma-informed mindfulness meditation and yoga instructor. And so I really believe in the power of all different kinds of healing modalities in recovery from trauma. And one reason that I really admire Tracy and the work that Tracy does is that I know she also believes really in the power of personalized journeys to healing and not a one size fits all approach. And I think that's something that's really empowering and liberating as survivors, to feel as though we are in charge of our own path and have all sorts of different options to choose from in curating that path. So Absolutely. That is a bit about me.
Awesome. What kind of led you down the road to picking trauma as the area that you wanted to work with?
I love this question. So for me, it was really an emerging experience. It wasn't like I have this memory of being 5 and thinking I want to be a trauma psychologist. I think really how it began is that I am a very emotionally sensitive person. I was really born into the world that way. I really feel the weight of pain in the world very deeply. And so I remember being very young and being just very aware of the different kinds of pains and suffering in the world. And due to some own experiences with trauma in my own life and the lives of loved ones, I became more aware the older I got of the prevalence of trauma and how many different kinds of traumas exist in the world. And I was really inspired to see how many people were able to experience really horrific, gut-wrenching traumas and yet still live lives that were meaningful, and they were still able to carry themselves with kindness and resilience and courage, and weren't beaten down by those experiences. Doesn't mean there weren't times where they might have felt beaten down by those experiences, because I think many of us can relate to those days, nights, weeks, months, year where we're in a lot of despair and are really struggling, but we're able to still live lives of meaning. And so I really wanted to learn how to help people do that. What is it that helps people recover and or live with horrible life experiences that they've been through, without losing their core sense of who they truly are? And so I was drawn to the study of psychology for that reason. And I think traditional Western psychology has so many benefits, and there's so much valuable research that supports some of those different tools. And I think there are certain limitations, and there are other tools that can complement that work, that can serve instead of that kind of work for certain people for whom that approach might not resonate. So I really dedicated myself to wanting to learn more. I really feel like a perpetual student. I think we're all always learning and can always add more to our toolboxes. And so I really wanted to keep adding to my toolbox so I could expand what I could offer people. And frankly, becoming a mother and becoming more aware of how many people are treated when they're pregnant, when they're in labor, becoming more acutely aware of what the Western medical system is like in a traditional hospital setting, how trauma uninformed many providers unfortunately are. Mm-hmm. I just was very naive to that. And then through my own experience of birthing my son, which was incredible and just awesome in the true sense of the word in so many ways. And there were aspects that were traumatic. And I just thought about other people going through that experience with less knowledge. I had trained as a doula. I had knowledge and wisdom, but thinking about people who didn't have the same kind of training or wisdom or learning, or who didn't have access to the same kinds of medical care, that I just was in such a privileged position. And yet I still experienced so much invalidation at the hands of some of the medical providers at one of the hospitals that's considered to be one of the best in the country. So it really just opened my eyes to the weaknesses in the system. And so I became much more passionate about working with people who had felt traumatized by the medical system in the context of their pregnancy and labor, who had experienced loss in the context of birth and pregnancy. And became just more aware of obstetrics violence and different ways in which that kind of trauma can affect someone. So it was really, I think, a long answer to your question, Tracy, is that it was really an evolving journey. Things just like one thing kind of led to another. Opportunities arose, listening to my gut and my passion about where I wanted to go. And all of these things kind of came together to where I am today.
I love it. That is a fantastic story of your journey. And, and it's got me thinking, as you were talking, I was thinking about my own births that I've had 4 kids, and 6 pregnancies. So I'm definitely well informed on the uninformed trauma policies and practices of doctors and hospitals over here. Those of us who have had sexual assaults, it can be really traumatic. Just the thought of giving birth, because you're going to have people poking and prodding in your nether regions, and all your stuff on display for everybody, and it can be really, really traumatic and scary. So I think it maybe stops a lot of women from having kids.
Yeah.
How do we reach them? How do we get them to understand that that these women have gone through something? When I say how do we reach them, I mean the doctors, the medical team. How do we get them to understand that these women have gone through something, and being subjected to, all the routine stuff that happens with the pregnancy can be very triggering.
Mm-hmm. I think this is a great question. And I think that it's important to approach change in the system from both an individual and collective perspective. And I think, unfortunately, as trauma survivors, it is often on us to educate people about the potential harms of their actions. And that's unfortunate. I wish that weren't the case, but I do believe that knowledge is power. And so I think in the context of having a child, considering having a child, learning as much as possible as you can about what the process involves can be a powerful way to learn more about the aspects that may be hard for you, that may be emotionally charged, that may be triggering. So, for example, is being naked going to be very hard for you? Is being tied to an IV going to be challenging? Is not having feelings in your legs? Is having male providers, people coming in your room who you don't know? The more that you learn about what the process is actually like, the more you can reflect on, okay, what are the parts of this that I anticipate might be activating for me? And not just the actual situations. Like you said, of course, there's the poking, there's the prodding. There's the way in which some of that can be approached, people doing things without explaining procedures,
Right.
touching without permission, all of that, right? And then there's also dynamics that can happen in childbirth and pregnancy that are akin to dynamics that can be present in sexual trauma. So, for example, feeling disempowered, feeling not in control of your body. There are some very intense sensations that can happen during childbirth, and that inability to control those sensations can feel reminiscent of sexual trauma. Now, it's not the case that every sexual trauma survivor has flashbacks or re-experiencing symptoms during labor. And there are people that I have known, that I have worked with, who got to a place in their trauma recovery who felt as though they had spent a lot of time and energy and effort in processing their sexual trauma, and then were quite surprised about something that became activated through their experience of labor and childbirth, or even breast or chest feeding, because that can be another aspect of this journey that can be challenging, is feeding a baby on demand, having a baby touch the breast in certain ways with certain types of pressure that can trigger body memory. So we can't anticipate everything, of course, but I do think the more we know about, what are some of the possibilities of how my labor could unfold? What kinds of interventions might I be offered? How might I feel? And having someone who also knows about the process, whether it's a trusted friend, a therapist who specializes in perinatal mental health, or a doula, midwife, someone that you can talk to and ask questions so that you can come up with a bit of a coping plan and can then articulate to people, if I am attached to an IV, I want to be able to move. I want to be able to get out of the bed, or coming up with some kind of sense of what works for you. I know that there are certain phrases that can be triggering to people because those can be reminiscent of sexual trauma. And so wanting to communicate to medical providers, hey, if I'm having a hard time, it helps if you say something like this versus that, because sometimes the actual words that people use, of course. So, of course, again, this puts a lot of work on us as survivors to sort through this. And yet I think it can also be empowering to feel like, okay, I can think this through. I can come up with a plan. Again, I can't anticipate everything, but with this plan in place, I can then share it with my team. And I think that's the second piece, is trying your best to find a team who is going to support you with this plan. And I don't think anyone even needs to disclose that they're a sexual trauma survivor. I think personally, my personal belief is that trauma-informed care is the care that everyone should be getting, regardless of trauma history. I don't think you
Agreed.
need to have a trauma history to be treated in this way. So I think that if you're not comfortable sharing that you're a sexual trauma survivor, you absolutely do not have to. And you can still say, because of who I am, because of my life experiences, here's what works for me. So you can communicate in a way that works for you, that feels empowered to you, where you don't feel pressured to overly disclose. No one needs to know why you don't want to be tied down to an IV, or why you want someone to explain why they feel like they need to do a cervical check, or why you want them to minimize the amount of cervical checks they do.
Mhm.
So I think also having that sense of compassion for yourself, that this is really up to you, and to find someone who can help you walk through this. I think that's really powerful too, so that you don't feel alone. And not everyone is a childbirth educator, right? And there are
Right.
certain things that even childbirth educators learn in their own process of supporting other people through birth or their own birth experiences, because as you all know, there are just so many ways that this can unfold. So I hope that's a helpful start in answering your question, Tracy.
I think that's a fantastic start, and you answered multiple questions with that. So that was fantastic. Um, something that I'm thinking of too, to keep in mind is with the doctor that you've chosen, you know, what happens when they're not on call,
Yes.
you
Mm-hmm.
know,
Mm-hmm.
because I know that with one of my doctors, there was like 4 or 5 of them in practice, and I could have gotten any single one of them. I got lucky and
Mm-hmm.
got my doctor, but I could have gotten any one of them who
Mm-hmm.
I've never seen, never met, never touched, never talked to,
Mm-hmm.
never, and now all
Mm-hmm.
of a sudden, boom, I've got this strange person down between my legs. Um,
Yes.
and that's, that could be very, very triggering, very
Absolutely.
activating for somebody. So that's definitely something to keep in mind. I was fortunate, and I was one of those that, even though I've had a history of sexual assault, the pregnancy and birth process did not trigger any of that. Um, and I think a lot of
Mm-hmm.
that is because I had a lot of that blocked at the time. But
Mm-hmm.
um, I can imagine, had I not, how triggering that would be.
Yeah.
I read a book. I can't remember the name of the book. I just read it recently too, and it was a woman talking about her story. She had been brutally assaulted at a young age, and when it came time for her wanting to have babies, she took the reins in her own hands. She took over control. She did the research. She found which hospital was the most
Mm-hmm.
trauma informed and would
Mm-hmm.
really work with her and her needs. And that's where she decided she was going to deliver. This was overseas though, where I think you have a little bit more freedom and flexibility than we do over here.
Mm-hmm.
But I think, like you said, by educating yourself and your team and all of that, you're empowering yourself
Mm-hmm.
and you're taking some of that control back,
Yes.
that
Mm-hmm.
we feel like we've lost.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think sometimes we forget or aren't aware that we do have certain choices when it comes to our medical care,
Mm-hmm.
because historically it's been a very paternalistic system where doctor knows best. And so sometimes the way options are presented to us are not presented as choices, even though they are choices. And so I think that is another important reason the research is really important, is so that when something gets presented to you, you can say, well, my understanding is that this is an option, not something I have to do, or something like that. So to be able to advocate for yourself. And I think when it's possible, having someone with you who is on the same page with you about your needs and can support you is also really valuable, because for anyone who's listening who has witnessed a birth or has been through the experience of birth or has spoken to someone who's been through the experience of birth, it can be really exhausting. And there can be a lot of emotions. It's a big transition. The body's going through a lot.
Yep.
Many people refer to it as a bit of a trauma because of what is happening in the body. And so we don't always have access to all of our faculties as well as we might in other circumstances. And so having someone that you trust who can help you advocate for yourself, so it's not so much pressure on you, I think can also be really valuable. So someone can even say, can you please leave the room while I talk to my friend about this decision, right? Even just having the medical people leave the room so you can take a deep breath and think about your options is really powerful, but it might not occur to you, all right, I can ask these people to leave. I can ask them to please step outside. Or I can ask if that intervention they're recommending is really necessary. Or I can say, hey, when you do that, could you use the mirror, not use the mirror? Can you, can my advocate, can my partner, can my friend stand next to me while you do that? Can I play music? Really just doing the research so that you're aware of what your options are, I think is really important, because it's not always how things are presented to us.
Absolutely. And not just with the doctors, but also with the hospital that you're going to.
Yes.
As well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, for sure. Mm-hmm. And that's, I think this is where having a doula or somebody who, like you said, can really advocate for you really is key, because you're wrapped up in the whole I'm trying to shove a baby out my body thing. Your partner is wrapped up in the whole she's shoving a baby out her body. I was thinking of my ex-husbands and the fact that they weren't a whole heck of a lot of help, because they're just so awestruck by what's happening. And so having that person who is there and that's their job is to advocate for you or advocate for you, I think is really crucial. Absolutely.
And there are people may be aware of this, but for those folks who aren't, there are doulas who are excellent, who are nearing the end of their training, who will attend births free of charge. So there are different options in terms of that. So to just know that even if it's something that you think may not be financially doable for you, there are options that are pro bono and free, and there are people out there who are offering that. So not to assume that you can't have access to that due to financial reasons.
Good to know. Wow, Melissa, this has been fantastic. Thank you so much.
Oh, you're so welcome.
How do we find you on the web?
Great question. So I would love for anyone who is interested to reach out, follow me. So I have an Instagram account, which is at Dr. Foynes. That's DrFoynes. I also have my own podcast called The Science and Soul of Living Well, where I talk about this integration of more evidence-based psychological healing modalities and Eastern philosophy, ancient traditions like yoga, meditation, mindfulness, spirituality. And I talk a lot about trauma and grief and pregnancy and labor and many other topics as well, parenting. So I encourage you to check that out. And I also have a website, which is melissafoynes.com. So if anyone is interested, please do reach out. I'd love to hear from you.
Fantastic. And listeners, you know the drill. I will have all of her information in the show notes. If you're listening on one of our partner stations, go to releasingtraumapodcast.com. Everything will be right there for you. Melissa, thank you so much again for coming on. This has been fascinating. And as a mother of 4, I wish there was, I had learned about a lot of this stuff before I had babies.
Well, you're so welcome. And I feel the same way. I wish that our society did a better job of supporting us in this very important process. So I have made it part of my mission to do what I can. And towards that end, I will also mention, I do have a couple of free resources for folks too, who may be interested. So I imagine that'll be in the show notes too. So thank you for having me. This is really a true pleasure and honor to be here.
All right. Well, thank you. The pleasure has been all mine. Listeners, thank you as always for tuning in, and we'll talk to you in the next episode.